Hey, sword friends, I've got a short one for you today. I was reading a historical account and it just happened to compare two very different types of swords, and I thought it was interesting enough to share. So, in the 17th century account, it matches up a Turkish saber, the Kilij, with an English rapier. Very interesting. Let's see what's going on here. So this is an account from the beginning of the 17th century, written by Mr. Henry Blount, and it's entitled A Voyage into the Levant, a brief relation of a journey lately performed by Master Henry Blount, gentleman from England by way of Venice into Dalmatia, Schiavona, Bologna, Hungary, Macedonia, Thessaly, Thrace, Rhodes, and Egypt into Grand Cairo, with particular observations concerning the modern condition of the Turks and other peoples under that empire. The second edition. This is from 1636. And so this is a time when the Ottoman Empire had obviously expanded out of Anatolia, controlled a lot of the Middle East, including the Levant all the way down into Egypt. And so this is the opinion of, again, one Englishman who has apparently spent some time over there. He's talking about some encounters where he's perhaps a little antagonistic with them, but also sometimes where he's very friendly with these Ottomans that he's meeting along the way. And obviously I'm interested in how the swords match up, and he has a couple of accounts where he's discussing the swords that he sees them wielding. I'm actually going to discuss the second account first, where he's just talking about how the Ottomans are equipping themselves. So initially he talks about how they wear all of these weapons. So it says, they bear no weapons, but in travel, then some of them seem like a moving armory. First, they gird themselves with 3 or 4 pistols, then on each side a knife as long as mine arm. So when he says a knife as long as mine arm, he's probably talking about one of these. I haven't talked about it too much on camera, but this is an antique yataghan. This is an Ottoman yataghan, which could be called a very, very large knife or a short sword. This is probably not 17th century. It might be very late 17th century, but more likely 18th century. And it's specifically a Zeybek yataghan. So it's a group that were effectively Ottomans that were living in Greece, if I remember correctly. We'll look into this in further detail in a different video. So they have these long knives as long as his arm, and with another that's a foot long for ordinary use tucked into their coat. So this is probably something like a kinjal instead. And a hakwabers on his shoulder, and on his thigh a scimitar, so the saber we were talking about. On one side of the saddle a pommel, a pertinel, I'm not sure what that is, and on the other side a straight sword, the blade hollow, long, and 4 square. So that's talking about a mech, so a type of estok that's used in Hungarian and Turkish and Polish cavalry. So something that's not seen too often. So he's discussed all the things he carries, but how do they feel they compare to what the English have? The Turks' arms much differ from ours. The hakwabers, like our kalver. So the hakwabers is very similar to the caliver, the more consistent type of hakwabers that was in use in Europe at the time. Their scimitar, a crooked, flat-backed sword, at sea among ropes or on horseback against armor, it excels a rapier. Very interesting in just those couple of lines. But in an open fight is much inferior. It hath ever been the Eastern weapon. So, that's a remarkable series of points in just a couple of lines of text. So he's talking about it being a crooked sword and a back sword. So it's curved and it has a flat back and a sharp edge. At this time in England, they did have back swords. They were mostly straight with a single edge. So think about basket-hilted swords, complex-hilted swords that just have a single chopping edge and are straight. They did have some sabers. You end up with usually shorter things, so things like hangers and cutlass that were starting to become popular. longer sabers, military sabers, were not as popular in England at this time. They were popular in places like Hungary and Poland. And he says that at sea, among ropes, so where there's lots of rigging and confusion on a ship's deck, this is a better weapon than the rapier. And that's no surprise. The rapier is this big swine of a blade, and in the confusion of a crowded ship's deck, while you certainly could carry it, this is perhaps not the best thing to have available to you, especially if you're going up against multiple opponents and have to change direction all the time. Something more compact like this we see is favored by sailors from a variety of different nations. So the cutlass, unsurprisingly, looks a lot more like this than like this. But much more interestingly, it says, on horseback against armor, it excels a rapier. Now, a lot of people think that if you're going up against armor, especially in a cavalry capacity, you wouldn't use a sword at all. But this author says not only were swords used, it sounds like rapiers were used sometime. A lot of people think that that never happened. And guess what? He says that even though rapiers were used, if you had a choice, you'd probably prefer to have this over this. So that means both of these were being used in period against armor at times. Now, what type of armors were in use at this time? Well, it was a transition period, so the heaviest configurations of armor from the 15th century were not as popular. We start seeing more of just simple cuirass and open-faced helms in use at this time. There were sometimes heavy configurations of armor still available, but it looks like you still had swords being brought to bear, even from horseback, at this time. Would it be better to have something else, like a lance or a pistol or a heavier sword like the estoc that we described? Probably. But if this is all you have, it says, this author says that this sword performs better in that capacity. However, it does go on to say that in an open fight, it's much inferior. So he says, no, the rapier's still going to beat this guy if it's just a one-on-one match. And that does kind of line up with what most people who study sword fighting seem to feel, that the rapier, even though you might be carrying it around in a kind of day-to-day capacity, this was developed in a time when dueling culture, especially like, for instance, Italian dueling culture, really was a very big and developed thing. And its design grew out of that sort of context. And so it excels in the one-on-one individual combat sort of environment where you have to reach out and touch the opponent without any interference in a nice, flat, level ground sort of environment. Now, you might still carry it around all the time and use it in other situations, and we do see these used in war environments even when helmets and armor are being worn. And again, there are various types of rapier. Some are better at that than in a strictly civilian environment. However, that doesn't mean it's going to be great in all environments, and that's what this our British author suggests. He suggests that the Turkish saber is actually a better take on all situations sort of to have than the rapier. That the rapier is great if you're just doing one-on-one, and we do have authors from the period, treaties, who teach rapier against various type of other combatants, including going up against heavy sabers or scimitars. So someone who is well practiced at the rapier should be prepared for an opponent who's wielding something like this, and how to be able to know to protect it against going up against someone who's trying to close the gap, etc. So that's a kind of interesting account. There's one last thing here that I think is kind of funny. So if we just go back to it, where it says, it ever hath been the eastern weapon, as likewise their iron mace, which they use both for stroke and hurl. So Matt Easton just had a video where he was talking about the context of use of mace in warfare, and mentioned that it's perhaps not that common in the 15th century when we have the heaviest configurations of armor, and does become more popular once we get to the 16th and 17th century, and that it is more common in Eastern Europe and as we get into the Middle East and the Islamic world. But this is the first time I've ever seen anyone mention throwing a mace. Has anyone else heard accounts of thrown maces? I personally have never, but I study swords. I don't study maces. So if you have any more of those accounts, please feel free to share them. So what do you guys think? Is this author biased? Were rapiers not used against armor that often? Would the scimitar beat the rapier on horse at sea? Would the rapierist be able to defeat an Eastern saber wielder very easily? Tell me what you guys think. Until next time, guys. Take care.